Will the Falcons' run game rebound in 2024?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. So, guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for too long. Formerly at FalFans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And you may know me as Mr. Drew, the Sirius Black, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. the Iron that Sharpens the Iron, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I thank each and every one of you that, checks me out each and every day as your first listen as an everydayer, right? And if you want to become an everydayer, all you got to do is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we're talking all about the offensive line and the run game, talk about Matthew Bergeron's year 2 breakout. And, we get into this conversation because one of the selling points for the everydayers of this podcast, right, is that, you're going to be a smarter fan today than you were yesterday, listening to this podcast each and every day as your first listen. And tomorrow you're going to be even smarter than you are today. And we collectively, as everydayers, listeners, and me talking on a microphone every single day, our collective BS detectors when it comes to the Atlanta Falcons are much more refined in the year of our Lord 2024 than they were in 2023 or 2020 or 2014 or any year prior to that. And my BS detector has been running haywire all off season long, much to the chagrin of many of my listeners, right? And a lot of that stems from, for me, the Falcons 2024 offseason and their roster feels too much like the Falcons off seasons and rosters that they had built in under previous regimes, such as Dan Quinn, right? Late stage Dan Quinn, post 2016 Dan Quinn teams, right? Now we're hoping that this 2024 Falcons team under Raheem Morris looks a lot more and feels a lot more like the 2017 Falcons that made the playoffs than the 2018 and 2019 and 2020 Falcons that did not. And when we talk about the complacency that some of those teams had throughout those off seasons, it was a little bit more forgivable because at least at points they were much more recently coming off of like double-digit win seasons than the current team that, now, being as complacent as they have been with 6 consecutive losing seasons, is a kind of leveling up their level of complacency. But, when we compare this year's team and those Dan Quinn-led teams, especially in those last 4 years of Dan Quinn, they're constructed very similarly, right? Both teams had a quarterback, Matt Ryan then, Kirk Cousins now. Both teams had premium or plus skill position players then and now, right? Both teams, had questionable defenses, especially when it came to the pass rush, because they run a lot of cover 3 zone, right? And you need to be able to get reliable pressure with 4 guys when you run a lot of cover 3 zone. And that, time will tell on this year's pass rush if they fall short of expectations or exceed expectations. But right now it doesn't look particularly promising, and we watch, despite, those Dan Quinn teams, and we'll see what happens this year, right? We watch those Dan Quinn teams, despite having all those weapons and firepower on offense, they were undermined because their defenses couldn't really stop teams. It didn't matter whether we were facing Patrick Mahomes or Marcus Mariota. We weren't really slowing down offenses on a consistent basis because we couldn't get pressure on the quarterback. Now, I think the 2 things that you can look at this year's team having that those Dan Quinn teams didn't have, and so the reasons for optimism is 1, good play calling, right, under Zach Robinson. Now, it remains to be seen how good a play caller he is, but we're hoping that Zach is going to give us more than what Sark and Cutter gave us in those latter Dan Quinn years. We're hoping that he's going to give us more of what Kyle Shanahan gave us early on in the Dan Quinn regime when everything seemed to be going well for that team. And so time will tell if Zach Robinson, where he fits on that spectrum, if Shanahan's on one end of the spectrum and Sark and Cutter on the opposite end of the spectrum, Arthur Smith as well on that same opposite end of the spectrum. We'll see where Zach Robinson fits on that spectrum. So that's a reason for hope. we're getting, another Shanahan type of dude in Zach Robinson. And the other thing that this team has in 2024, that those Dan Quinn teams, especially, after 2017, right? And one of the reasons why the 2017 team was able to make the playoffs and the 2018, 2019, and 2020 teams weren't, is because this team allegedly, in emphasis, the 2024 Falcons allegedly have a run game, right? The 2017 Falcons could run the football, right? The 2024 Falcons, and the 2017 Falcons had good offensive lines, right? This offensive line is allegedly one of the best in football. And I say allegedly because the Falcons are essentially running it back with the same players, unit, coaches that they had last year. That was a bottom 5 run team instead of the top 5 run team that we thought they were going to be. And we talked about how this last year's run game, their combined success rate, which is, our preferred rushing efficiency metric, was the same in 2023 as it was in 2020 when it was like a wash, Todd Gurley and Ito Smith and Brian Hill and all those guys running the rock and James Carpenter blocking up front and all that stuff. And so when you're looking for reasons to be optimistic, the reasons why you're optimistic that this team is going to be more like the 2017 Falcons than the 2018 or 19 Falcons is because of that rebound that the run game is going to have. They're not going to look like the same unit that they did a year ago, that they're going to look more like the unit they were the previous year in 2022 when they were an elite running team than they were in 2023 when they were closer to the bottom of the league. And you need the run game to be kind of the foundation of your offense this year. And when we talk about foundation, we're talking about, the identity and all that various things, that when a defensive coordinator is preparing each week for the Falcons offense, he says, we have to stop X, whatever the X is, right? And X can be a player, it can be players, it can be a position group, right? That's what the good teams have. They have something, some X factor that other defenses and teams look at and say, we got to stop that, because if we don't stop that, they're going to beat us, right? Now, in those Dan Quinn years, that X factor was Julio Jones, right? We talked about Julio being the sun, the gravity in which all the other planets in the offense revolves around. And as high as I may be, and maybe you are, on Drake London and Kyle Pitts and what they can be this year with Zach Robinson, with Kirk Cousins, I don't think it's fair to expect those guys to be on the same level as Julio Jones, who was the most explosive wide receiver in NFL history and on the Mount Rushmore of the wide receiver greats, right? This wall behind me is all where all the GOATs go, right? Julio's on that wall, as you can see. Aaron Donald's on that wall. Toph Beifong is on that wall, right? Only the GOATs go on that wall, right? Greatest of all time, for those of you not familiar with that term. And so while I think Drake and Kyle can be very good, and if Zach Robinson is doing his thing, they can be one of the better wide receiver duos in the league. And we've seen glimpses of them play at a high level, right? Not at the same time. Hopefully it will be at the same time. And rather than seeing a couple of games here or there, like we saw for Kyle in his rookie year and Drake in his rookie year and a couple of games last year for Drake, hopefully we can see that consistently over an entire 17-game season together, right? That's going to be the big challenge for Zach Robinson on a weekly basis. But whatever gap we have from what Julio was, the sun, to whatever Drake and Kyle are going to be, Jupiter or whatever, you need the running game to kind of make up the difference. So if Julio was a 10 and Drake and Kyle are an 8, right, you need your run game to be kind of a +2 to make up that difference between those two areas. And really you need them to be more than a +2 because you need it to be better than what we had in the Dan Quinn years, right? You need that run game to be kind of a +3 or a +4 or +5 or something like that. And the question is, can they be that? The potential is there, but they weren't that last year, right? And that seems to be the big thing that everybody forgets when they think about why the Falcons spent all their resources upgrading the head coach, the play caller, the quarterback this offseason, and be like, that solved all their problems, right? The Falcons made the bet in 2023 that their run game was going to be the foundation like it was in 2022. And they came up short of those expectations. And that's why I tend to be a little bit more skeptical of this 2024 team than a lot of you guys are, because we're betting that, this year is going to be more like 2022 than it was like 2023, even though the players are the same as they were in 2023 and not the same as they were in 2022. And we're going to find out pretty early this season which year is the outlier. Is it 2022 that's the outlier where they were an elite run game, or was 2023 the outlier where they weren't, right? And that gets us to the next part of our conversation, where this offensive line cannot be as inconsistent as they were in the first half of 2023. They cannot be that in 2024. And the question is, are they up for the challenge? And there's going to be some real challenges for this offensive line in the beginning of the season, and we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But guys, this next segment is brought to us by our sponsor, BetterHelp. And sometimes we all need that opportunity to get something off our chest, big or small, whether we're talking about the big offensive linemen or the small wide receivers that the Falcons have. Certain things can start to get to you as they get to me. And it's important to let that out, especially as someone who is unbiased in your life. And that's where therapy can help you, right? I have the benefit of being able to talk to a therapist as well as venting some of my frustrations on the podcast. But not everybody has a podcast, right? Therapy can be different for everyone, right? Most of us have bigger issues than what our favorite sports team is doing or not doing in the offseason. And it's important to get those things off our chest every once in a while. So if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be flexible, convenient, and suited to your schedule. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon, and you'll get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. Guys, before we get into the conversation about whether or not the offensive line is up for the challenge this year, let's talk about Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 streaming sports channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories, can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. If you're looking for the biggest stories locally, check out Locked On Sports Atlanta as well on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So it was interesting hearing Bijan talk to the media on Monday after practice. And he was sort of asked what the run game was going to look like. And he sort of reiterated something that we've heard from the coaches and other people in the organization, and something that you've heard from me on this podcast, that this run game is probably going to be, sort of featured, right? Run first, balanced, whatever word you want to use to describe it. But the point is there's going to be an emphasis on the run game this year, right? And Bijan mentioned how the wide zone is going to be the foundation, but they're going to potentially diversify some things, right? And we've heard that again from coaches and others within the organization, that the wide zone is going to be the sort of foundation, the staple of their run game. But hopefully they'll vary things up, right? Arthur Smith did not do that. He was just basically like, it's wide zone every down all the time, right? Wide zone, outside zone, whatever you want to call it. We had Luke Braun of Locked On Vikings come on the podcast last week, talk about how middle zone or inside zone sort of being the hallmark of the Rams run scheme under Sean McVay. And that was something that was imported from Kevin O'Connell to Minnesota. And so we're expecting to see more of that here in Atlanta with Zach Robinson calling things than we have seen under the past with Arthur Smith. And it's a question mark right now if the offensive line is going to be able to make that adjustment and make that adaptation to more middle inside zone type of stuff, because they weren't asked to really do that at all last year, right? The Falcons ran between the tackles 107 times, according to ProFootballReference.com last year, by far the lowest in the NFL. The average in the NFL last year was 222 times, so less than half of the average in the NFL. And I don't necessarily know where the Falcons stack up league-wide when they did choose to run between the tackles inside, but I did run the numbers on their success rate, at least on first and second down on those inside runs, and it was about 45.5%. Again, don't know how that stacks up against the rest of the league, but I did look at the top 4 teams, right, in terms of the teams that ran the most on the interior, making the assumption sort of like they wouldn't run it as much if they weren't good at it. And those teams were Buffalo, New England, Indianapolis, and Philadelphia. And at least on those early downs, on inside runs, Buffalo had a success rate of 59%. Philadelphia was 53.5%. Indianapolis was 49%. And New England was 47.6%. So clearly the Falcons have a ways to go to at least be on par with some of the upper level teams in the NFL when it comes to that interior run game. So there's definitely room for improvement with the Falcons. And, the film kind of backs up what the stats are kind of showing a little bit here, because I can recall many instances watching that offensive line in 2022 when the Falcons did run inside zone and duo stuff, where they would ask Elijah Wilkinson and Drew Dahlman to kind of double team guys on those combo blocks that are staples of those inside run schemes and duo stuff. I don't recall that many instances of seeing Matthew Bergeron and Drew Dahlman do that last year. Right. And so to me, the moral of the story is the offensive line has to step up, and we won't really know if they're going to do that until we get to September 8th. 1 p.m. Eastern time, because we're not going to really get too many opportunities to see them show what they can do between now and then. over the next 3 months, right? That's not something you're going to get an opportunity to do in OTAs, right? It's not even really something that you're going to be able to see in training camp because you only have a limited number of padded practices. And, the guys that you're going up against on the Falcons defensive line are probably not, in certain areas true. We'll see. But the caliber of some of the guys you're going to face during the regular season, not to mention, we've talked about this before with the McVay disciples, which Raheem Morris is now technically part of, right? They don't tend to play their starters in the preseason. So we might not even get these guys, a couple of snaps in the preseason to really gauge where they are. And so you can't have them doing this upcoming season what we saw far too often of in the first half, especially in the first half of the 2023 season, where this offensive line was getting bodied by high-end defensive linemen, right? Derek Brown, Brian Burns in week 1, Kenny Clark, and the rest of the Green Bay Packers boys in week 2, Aiden Hutchinson, Lee McNeil in week 4, Jeffrey Simmons, Danico Autry, Arden Key in week 8, and whatnot. And it was very up and down season in that first half of the season for the Falcons offensive line. Now, they eventually figured out in the second half, right, where you didn't see that many instances of them just getting their butts kicked like we saw in the first half. But we can't afford to wait until the second half of the season because we have a tough slate of games in the first part of the season. In that first month of the season, Pittsburgh in week 1, Jalen Carter and the Eagles in week 2, Chris Jones and the Chiefs in week 3, right? You got those divisional matchups from weeks 4 to 6, right? Now, I'm not currently too worried about what the Saints D-line is going to do as we sit here today. We'll see. But, Vita Vea and Derek Brown are coming, and those are guys that have historically given this offensive line a lot of problems over the years. And so you can't necessarily have the ups and downs this year like you had last year. Now, maybe you can get away with having a subpar performance against Kansas City because most people don't expect the Falcons to beat the Chiefs. And so, yeah, Chris Jones can go off that game and do whatever he does, right, as a future Hall of Famer, one of the great knee tackles of all time, right? But you can't let that happen against Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, right? And our good friend Mike Singletary has the perfect segue to tell us what can't happen.
Can't do it.
So you can't let that happen against those two teams to start the season, right? We couldn't block 2 guys on Carolina. Pittsburgh has 5 guys, right? Alex Highsmith, Larry Ogunjobi, Keanu Benton, K.M. Hayward, and T.J. Watt. And so when we talk about being positive and optimistic, it's like, do you feel positive and optimistic that Caleb Gary is going to be able to block T.J. Watt because that's who he's going to block on like 97% of his snaps? Right? You feel positive and optimistic that Matthew Bergeron is going to be able to handle Cameron Hayward because that's where Cameron Hayward lines up the vast majority of the time. And when he's not going up against Bergeron on that side of the D-line, it's going to be Jake Matthews. And we love Jake Matthews as a pass protector here on the Locked On Falcons podcast. But as a run blocker, it's not been great these last couple of years. He was very good in 2022, which was a big reason why the run game was so effective that year. Less effective in 2023 in terms of Jake Matthews, right? And when we talk about Jake Matthews in the run game, to me, again, not to say that it's all Jake Matthews, but it's notable to me that the 2 years where the Falcons could run the football, Jake Matthews had a good year, right? 2017 and 2022. And the other, 5-6 years outside of that, Jake Matthews wasn't great. He wasn't adding plus value as a run blocker in those other years. And so we can't necessarily have the quote unquote typical Jake Matthews run blocking season this year, right? Because if we do have the typical year, then it means the left guard, it means the tight ends are going to have to compensate that much more for this deficiency at the left tackle position when the Falcons do decide to run left, which they struggled to do last year, in large part due to the struggles of both guys on the left side of the ball. Now, the Parker Hesse agenda was thriving last year, and we're hopeful that the Charlie Warner and Ross Dwelly agenda is thriving this year. And the upgrade that the Falcons have made at the tight end position in terms of their blocking will boost the run game, right? But the thing that's sort of stood out to me the last couple of weeks is I'm reading these quotes from Zach Robinson about how excited he is about Kyle Pitts' untapped potential as a blocker. And I'm like, really? We're excited about Kyle Pitts as a blocker? That's what we're excited about? Now, we've talked before about the expectation that Kyle Pitts will be used more in line. I do expect Kyle Pitts to be a better, more effective blocker this year than he was last year because he's going to be healthier, right? We've talked before about how, it's kind of hard to explode out of that 3-point stance as an inline tight end when you have a bum knee, right? Than it is. And that's one of the reasons why the Falcons, had Kyle Pitts so rarely as an inline tight end last year, right, to sort of take pressure off of that need. But like still, even with an improvement in terms of the health of the knee, like Kyle Pitt's not really the guy that I want blocking at the point of attack when it comes to that position. So we'll sort of see how that all goes. But if the tight end position, we'll figure that out. But talking about the other part of the running to the left, right? If Jake doesn't step up, we need the left guard to step up. And that's where the Matthew Bergeron conversation comes on. And we've talked all week about like the defensive breakout candidates. And let's switch sides and talk about the one guy on offense that is kind of an unknown and whether or not he's going to have and live up to his breakout potential in year 2. And that's what we're going to do to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Now, guys, Game Time is making getting NBA Finals tickets faster and easier, and prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer you get to tip-off. And you want that when it comes to NBA Finals tickets because, I know a lot of people are like, hey, you're going to spend a pretty penny trying to get to the NBA Finals, this weekend and next week and whatnot. And that's true, but Game Time is doing what they can to help you save money. They got last-minute deals that can save up to 60% on last-minute buys, whether you're looking for NBA Finals, other sports, concerts, music, theater near you, right? Their lowest price guarantee means they're going to credit you 110% the difference if you can find cheaper tickets in the same section in a row. And their flash deals means you're going to save on exclusive in-app deals on select seats ahead of the game. So take the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets with Game Time by downloading the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL. And you'll save $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL, LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last-minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. So, guys, we'll probably get back to, some of these defensive, breakout standouts, tomorrow on this podcast as your first listen. So make sure you give us that like, that subscribe so that you don't miss it. Let's try to get 11,000 subscribers before we get to training camp. But I know some of you guys don't want to subscribe because it's like, Aaron, you're being Mr. Drew, that negative Nancy far too much. And like, I'm going to be, I'm going to don the Mr. Drew shirt, cap, whatever you want to call it, persona to close out today's episode. But, I've been hearing a lot of people, hyping up, praising Matthew Bergeron over the last 6 months. And I'm talking about his bright future. And I'm just like, did we watch a completely different team and player last year? Because I didn't see that. Now, the excuse for Matthew Bergeron and some of his struggles that he had in year 1 was the transition to a brand new position. We've talked before about how that's typically, something that you can struggle with, especially early on in the NFL. That when we talk about the rookies that have been successful in recent years that, sort of hit the ground running, it were players that, were left tackles in college, came in and were left tackles in the pros or whatever position they were playing. So that position switch does matter. But I think that's more relevant when it comes to pass protection, right? We've talked a lot over the last 3-4 years, starting with Jalen Mayfield and Matthew Bergeron last year about, some of the challenges and difficulties and some of the things that are different when you're making that transition from tackle to guard, right? What you're expected to do from a skill set, technical standpoint that are very different playing guard and tackle in the NFL, but that mostly applies in pass protection. That doesn't really provide, translate to run blocking, at least in my opinion, right? And so I'm willing to forgive a lot of the pass protection issues that Bergeron showed in year 1 because of that transition. I'm hard pressed to forgive some of the run blocking issues because to me, run blocking is run blocking, right? Technique, skill set don't really change all that much whether you're playing tackle, guard, or center, in my humble opinion. Now, again, maybe there's other people out there that will disagree on that. But, the way I sort of see it, especially when you're playing the outside zone scheme that the Falcons are playing, where you're asking guys to make reach blocks all the time, right? Reach block is a reach block, whether you're playing tackle, guard, or center or not, right? And that was what was so disappointing to me watching Matthew Bergeron last year was the strength of his game coming out of Syracuse was his ability as a run blocker, right? Myself, I thought that. Brandon Thorne thought that. He's sort of one of our foremost, O-line gurus out there when he came on the podcast last year. And outside of that first Saints game, I thought Matthew Bergeron struggled mightily last year as a run blocker. And the reason why is because he couldn't really make those reach blocks, that we needed him to make it in sort of this outside zone scheme. And I saw him make those blocks at Syracuse, and I saw him struggle making those blocks in the NFL. And that's what gives me a little bit of pause about Matthew Bergeron when it comes to those things. Like the things that he should have done well, like the run blocking stuff as a rookie, he didn't particularly do well. Now, despite my criticism, I still do have optimism for what he can be in year 2. Now, my optimism may not be on the same level that your optimism is, right? Like if you're at an 8 out of 10, like mine might be like a 4 out of 10 or something like that. But hey, this is why we have Dwayne Ledford, right? D-Led, not that D-Led, the different D-Led, right? The good D-Led is going to fix it, right? So, it's got to get fixed, right? It's got to get fixed immediately because, again, as we said, early in the season, you're going to face some premier D tackles. Week 1, Cam Hayward. Week 2, Jalen Carter. Week 3, Chris Jones. Later, Derek Brown, Vita Vea. Later in the season, Dexter Lawrence, Jonathan Allen, Leonard Williams, Christian Wilkins, etc. And so the question is going to be, is Matthew Bergeron going to be able to block those guys? And we're not going to really know the answer to that until 3 months when we see him on the field, right? And so when it's someone like me that actually, watches the games, like these are the things that ultimately to me matter when it comes to what decides whether or not the Falcons are going to win games in September and October and November and et cetera, then not, right? And I can't just simply come on the podcast and tell you, hey, it's going to be okay and it's all going to work out, right? And this is why, this time of year when everybody else is getting hyped about, here are my top 3 standouts and OTAs this year, and I'm just like, who cares, right? Like people are getting hyped about Michael Penix. Did you see that pass from Michael Penix to Casey Washington? Oh, man, it's going to be incredible. And I'm like, none of that matters, right? If everything goes according to plan this year, like those guys are going to play 7 snaps combined this year. Who cares what they do in practice, right? You watch Kirk Cousins and Drake London, link up against air. And it's like, okay, cool. You did it against air. Now you got to do it with TJ Watt bearing down on you. Now you got to do it with Chris Jones and Max Crosby bearing down on you. That's really when it matters, right? And so when I sit here and I say, like, when the Falcons are going to be good this year, if they're going to be good this year, it's going to be because so many of the things that didn't work out last year, like the run game, do work out this year. It's not going to be because Kirk Cousins, they upgraded a quarterback simply, and that's not going to solve all their problems. It's going to solve some of their problems. It's not going to solve all of their problems, right? Kirk Cousins cracking dad jokes in the huddle is not going to mean that Matthew Bergeron is now going to be able to make his reach block against Cam Hayward come week 1. And so that's where a lot of the negativity comes from. It's frustration, right? That the Falcons, their modus operandi, their method of operation, their MO is so often over these last, 15 years. This is year 15 of me podcasting about the Falcons. This will be the 15th season that I have podcasted about the Falcons. And I know some of you guys are like, you've been doing this for 15 years and you're still this bad talking to microphone. Like, hey, leave me alone. Okay. we all can't be great at this, right? We have our strengths and our weaknesses, but the Falcons MO over that period of time is just like, so often just to kind of do nothing and just hope the problems go away. And this is what I talk about with the complacency. And this is why, like, I'm much more critical of the Falcons than a lot of other people out there. And my peers are, because I look at what good teams do and I sit here and I go, like, the Falcons don't do the same things that good teams do. Like, for example, I'll use one example, right? Like the Chiefs get all the credit in the world. We all know the Chiefs are great. And everybody says, oh, the reason why they're great is because they have a great head coach and a great quarterback. And like, don't get me wrong, they're a big part of the conversation. But what the Chiefs do that no one gives them credit for is that they solve problems, right? We saw this a couple of years ago when they lost that Super Bowl because their offensive line. Guess what? They got 5 new starters the next offseason, and they've had a great offensive line ever since. Right? That following year after losing that Super Bowl, they got beat by the Bengals in the playoffs. And they were like, we need to fix our defense. And guess what? They invested resources in their defense, hit on some draft picks, and they've had one of the best defenses in the NFL for the last couple of seasons, the last 2 seasons since then. Right? And then you look at this past year. What was their big problem? They had no juice. They had no pass catchers. So what did they do? They went out and signed Hollywood Brown and Xavier Worthy and drafted that guy. And now they have juice and pass catchers. That's why the Chiefs are able to maintain at the high levels. And that to me is why the Falcons struggle to maintain. That's why they tend to underachieve from reaching whatever goals they set, whether it was, 8 years ago trying to win a Super Bowl, or 12 years trying to win a Super Bowl, or now over the last 6 years trying to make the playoffs. They constantly underachieve because they just basically do nothing and just think the problem's going to go away. And again, we're talking about the offensive line. I didn't expect the Falcons to go out there and sign 5 new starters or anything like that. Wish they would have been a little bit more aggressive trying to improve their depth at the very least, even if they were willing to run it back. And I don't have a problem with them running it back with the same starting 5, but the same 3 backups, like, all right, we're really doing this with Kyle Hinton. Okay. Like Newsel, Storm Norton, I get, but like, okay. But that's where my frustration comes from, right? Because it's just like, they're just so complacent. They've been complacent for so many years. And like, I sit here each and every day on this podcast, guys, in June, and I just can't ignore it. right? Like that's, I don't say these things to be negative. I just sit here and I go like, this is the time of year when you can fix these issues, because if you're waiting to September and October and whatever, and like, we'll figure it out then, it's like, it's going to be too late by that point. Now is the time to do it. So we'll just sort of have to sit here, hope this team exceeds my expectations like they did in 2016. I did not have high expectations for that team. Again, I expect this team to be a playoff team because they have to be a playoff team, because I can't do another non-playoff season. I can't do 7 years. I've done 6. I can't do a 7-year. So I don't know what I'm going to do. I got to talk to my therapist about that. Sign up betterhelp.com/lockedon. Right. So, we'll see what the Falcons do if they exceed expectations like they did in 2016. Right. Big reason why, because they had great play calling. That's why you constantly hear me talk about Zach Robinson and how critical and important he is to the upcoming season. So we'll see if the Falcons can solve these problems. I hope they do. I really do. But that's why I sit here and I complain about this stuff. I wouldn't be here. I got here where I got here because I complained about the Falcons really well. I do. I'm just a good complainer about the Atlanta Falcons. So I'm going to keep complaining until they address these issues. And so, again, to me, it's not really about the offensive line, even though that's the bulk of the conversation is really about the pass rush. That's why we've been talking about the pass rush so much. I'm just like, really, this is what we're doing? Okay, we're doing this. All right, fine. It's whatever. So hopefully these problems get solved this upcoming season, and we'll be back with more complaining. Tomorrow's episode, talking about some of these young defensive breakout stars. Maybe we've talked a little bit about, Arnold Bichetti and Troy Anderson. Earlier this week, we still have, Zach Harrison and Clark Phillips and Richie Grant and, whoever else we got coming up. So we'll continue to talk about it. We'll talk more about, Brandon Dorlus and JD Bergeron and the rest of this Falcons draft class, day 3 of this draft class, as the month continues. And of course, we got the Falcons Historian Shootout coming your way with myself, Alan Stirk, talking about Devontae Freeman. We're going back to those Dan Quinn days with that first episode next week. Featuring Jarvis Davis and Corey Woodruff going head-to-head, talking about Devontae Freeman, as well as other players from back in the day, stars from the Falcons over the last 2 decades. So that is all in store for you guys. Continue to check us out here on this illustrious podcast. That's going to do it for us here as your first listen. For your second listen, check out Locked On Sports Atlanta, Locked On Sports Today. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.